volunteer hospice? The organization was founded in 1978 by Rose Crum, a local nurse on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. We are one of very few independent hospices in the United States offering holistic nursing care without billing Medicare, any insurance company, or anyone else. All our services are provided free of charge, as are things like this, and that gives us a lot of flexibility in how we offer our services. And Astrid, who just spoke a minute ago, manages all the volunteers at the organization, which runs more than 80% of our organization, and she creates the entire Soul Care series. Aside from the speaker series, the Soul Care program offers monthly death cafes called Tea to Die For, which is an informal, in-person gathering to share thoughts on death, dying, and to share coffee and tea and cake while you're doing it. The next speaker series will be on Wednesday, July 10th, and it will be a documentary called Prison Terminal, followed by a panel discussion with the Humane Prison Project. The details for that will be on the website at volunteerhospice.org. So I'm very excited to see all of you here today for this topic, the art of holding space, with Heather Plett. We've all heard that term, holding space, but what does it really mean? In this workshop, Heather, the author of The Art of Holding Space, a practice of love, liberation, and leadership, will explore that concept, especially as it relates to death and dying. She'll talk about what it means to be the bowl, how an understanding of liminal space helps us deepen our practice, and why we are sometimes tempted to hijack space instead of holding it. Heather's understanding of this concept was deepened when she accompanied her mom in her dying. So she's delighted to be able to speak with people who serve this field. Besides having written The Art of Holding Space, an award-winning book, she also recently released another book, Where Tenderness Lives, on healing, liberation, and holding space for oneself. She's also the co-founder of the Center of Holding Space. She's an international speaker, facilitator, and writer, and her work has been translated into a dozen languages and referenced in such notable publications as the Harvard Business Review and Psychology Today. She has trained people from 6 continents, both in person and online. Before launching this work and holding space, Heather worked in leadership and communications in government and nonprofit. Having spent most of her adult life in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, where she raised 3 daughters, Heather has recently moved to Vancouver Island. Heather, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you now.
It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And Lisa, before you unmute, I just want to double check. It's 90 minutes, right? The workshop? An hour and a half? Okay. I just wanted to get it right so that I ended on at the right time. All right. It's a pleasure to be here. I've just recently moved to Vancouver Island, so I'm just across the water and across an international border from you. But I feel like we're connected in deeper ways than our borders might suggest. We have threads that cross borders and connect us, and so it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, as Lisa said, I've been immersed in this work of holding space for quite some time. It really, I think it started to grow in me before I had language for it. About almost 25 years ago, to be honest, I gave birth to a stillborn son and was in the hospital for about 3 weeks during that time, trying to save that pregnancy and trying to, but I didn't manage to give birth to a healthy baby. In the end, he died. But in those 3 weeks in the hospital, there was something that was beginning to grow in me, something that recognized a need for a different way of experiencing the world, a different way of understanding relationships, and a different way of being with the hard things in life. And and knowing how, or having some intuitive somatic sense of how to be present when, for example, a baby is dying, or a person in our life is dying. And so that was really the birth of the work. Those were the early days before I had adopted the language. But then a few years after that, I came into contact with this concept of holding space. And I'm trained as a facilitator and coach, and do leadership development work at that time. And the language of holding space first came out of the facilitation world for me. And when I heard the term, I was intrigued with it, but it didn't like, it was still a concept that needed to grow and expand in me. At first, it was just an understanding of how to facilitate a room, how to hold space. And then what happened is my mom was dying. And in the months before her dying, my work that had started to grow into a larger practice of training and development and writing practice suddenly became smaller and smaller. And I saw it kind of shrinking to the size of a deathbed, essentially. The spaces I had held, I'd been hosting larger and larger circles, and then suddenly, well, not suddenly, but over this time, found myself sitting in smaller and smaller circles until it was just myself and my mom and sometimes my siblings. And I knew that there was some learning in that smaller space for me. And I've always been a believer that our lives tend to go on an ebb and flow, and sometimes an expansion, sometimes a contraction. And it was in that contraction that some of the greatest wisdom came for me, that really invited me into a new calling. After my mom died, I wrote a blog post. It was actually almost 2 years after she died. I had been wrestling with this concept of holding space. And what happened was my siblings and I all stayed in my mom's home for about 5 days before she died. As she was dying, we decided to care for her in her own home. And so we gathered, my brother flew in and my other siblings all gathered. And we spent that really intense time with her as she was dying. And during that time, we had a palliative care nurse that was coming regularly to the home and providing the support that we didn't know how to provide for mom, and doing some of the tasks that were difficult for us as her children, like bathing mom and things like that. And there was something really beautiful and unique about what this nurse was bringing to that space. She was creating a container for us to support our mom. And she wasn't doing that in a really obvious way. It wasn't like she walked in and offered this as an offering, but it was something about her presence, something about the way that she communicated with us, something about just her intuitive sense of how much information to give to us and how much to not give us, to not overwhelm us with information. And just her gentle way of guiding us through this process of being with our mom. And so it took me some time to articulate what it was that this palliative care nurse was offering. And eventually what happened is I wrote a blog post about it. And I talked about how the expression of what she was offering really was a practice of holding space. And so I defined holding space by using the palliative care nurse. Her name was Anne, using her as an example to guide us in understanding that concept. And that blog post went intensely viral all over the world. In the first 6 months, it was seen by about 10 million people. It actually crashed my website at the time because there was such intensity of people visiting it. And it was such a profound moment for me, recognizing that this was a concept that was needed in the world, that we needed understanding and language for this concept. And I I never suggest that I created the concept because I didn't come up with the term. And also people have been doing it for eternity. In fact, I have a really close friend who's an elder in a First Nations Indigenous tribe in Nevada. And she says holding space has been a part of her practice as a shaman, as an elder in that culture, and it has been forever in their culture. And so I don't claim any ownership over this. What I have offered the practice is some language, some frameworks, some ways of shaping and understanding what we're doing so that we can better articulate it and deepen our practice in it. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. I tend to host these conversations largely in circle because I love good conversation. I love meaningful interactions with people. I am less of a kind of sage on the stage than I am a host in the circle. So I am going to do a presentation just for your own deepening of your understanding, but then I'm going to pause periodically and open it up for conversation because I'd very much like to hear your reflections and questions along the way. I'm going to share my screen now, though, and we'll get started. All right, so you're seeing that on the screen? Okay. So this is a picture of myself with my mom as my mom was dying, and I just offer that as a start point. I'm going to pause there for a moment because it is, I've heard from a lot of people that that photo alone has had some impact on them. And I understand from the work that you do as hospice care volunteers that this is something that feels very relevant to you to understand that moment of sitting with somebody as they are dying. Here's the definition of holding space that I wrote in my book, The Art of Holding Space. Holding space is what we do when we walk alongside a person or group on a journey through liminal space. And I'm going to talk about that concept of liminal space a little bit more later. We do this without making them feel inadequate, without trying to fix them, and without trying to impact the outcome. We open our hearts, offer unconditional support, and let go of judgment and control. So that's a starting point of this practice, what it means. When we hold space, what I tend to be a visual thinker, so I'm always looking for a visual metaphor that will help me unpack a concept. And I started to talk about what it means to be the bowl when we're holding space. There's a creation of this kind of containment and holding that we do. And the very first time I was presenting this concept at a conference, after my blog post went viral and I started getting invited to speak about it, I took these photos because I was imagining what we're doing when we're holding space. It's like what happens when a Lego structure, let's say somebody has built a Lego house and they need to deconstruct it in order to build the next thing. In that deconstruction process, there's a lot of mess, and that mess can be really painful. Anybody who's walked around the house, and especially in the dark after bedtime, when your children have been playing with Lego and they maybe didn't put it all away, you know the destruction that can be caused, the pain that can be caused when you don't hold that deconstruction process. And so this is what I developed as a bit of a metaphor for that deconstruction, that's the liminal space of the transition that we're holding. And so that's why the bowl of Lego in that image. When I first developed the concept and started talking about the bowl, I would talk about the qualities of the bowl. And I had only one layer at the beginning about the qualities that we're holding and that we're offering when we're holding that container. But the more I deepened this practice, the more I understood it, I realized there are actually 3 layers of the bowl, and that made more sense for me. And so the inner layer is what you offer. That's the part that the people touch. That's what they receive when you're holding space. And then the middle layer is what guides you. That's your internal guidance system. And then the outer layer is what supports you, because in this work of holding space, we have to be held as well. It's a collective practice. And by having these kinds of gatherings, by having a network like this, you're learning also to be that outer bowl for each other, to be that support system for each other as you do this practice. So the inner layer, what you offer, the words that are in there are things like witness, bearing witness to what's going on, some containment, offering some shape or some safety or whatever is needed in terms of a container. There's compassion, selective non-judgment. When I first was teaching about this, I used the words non-judgment, and I realized that there was some limitation with that language of non-judgment, because there are moments when you have to use your best judgment in a situation to make a judgment call, to make a choice, to use your discernment. For example, if you're holding space for somebody who has broken the law and you recognize the need for this person to turn themselves in, then you have to use some judgment. And so I don't want to create a practice that needs you to step away from your own discernment capacity. And that's why I put the word selective in front of it. Guidance is similar. I said selective guidance. You give the guidance that's needed, but you are selective about it. Again, it's a discerning practice of what guidance is needed. And that palliative care nurse, for example, she didn't come in there with a whole textbook full of what to do when someone's dying. She just told us the information we needed to know for the next step in the process. And then she came back again and gave us a little bit more information. And so she used her own intuition to know what guidance we needed. Space for complexity, that's recognizing that every situation is complex and multi-layered. There are multi-layered relationships involved in every situation. There are other people that are impacted by a situation. There are things like power imbalances, and race might be an issue, or oppression of some kind. Somebody might be a person with disabilities, or a person who's been oppressed because of their gender or sexuality. So understanding those complexities. And then autonomy. Autonomy is recognizing each person is a separate and sovereign individual and has a right to make their own choices. So you're not taking control when you're holding space. You are honoring their autonomy and dignity. Flexibility, that's a willingness to change or to adapt to the situation. Connection, fairly obvious, that's that relational piece. And then allyship. This was the last word I added to this, because I recognize sometimes when you're holding space, that person also needs an ally, somebody who might stand up for them in the system, that might provide some advocacy. If that person, for example, if you're supporting somebody who does not have a lot of power in the system, or one of the examples I use when I'm holding space, when my daughters were still in high school, I could hold space for what they were going through. And then sometimes I needed to step in alongside them and go into the school system to help advocate with them or stand as their ally in that system. And so that's the allyship piece that got added. The middle layer of the bowl, this is what guides you. This is the stuff going on inside. And to be honest, more and more as I do this practice, and I have developed training programs. I do an 8-month online training program on the art of holding space. What I recognize more and more that 95%, I don't know the exact percentage, but a majority of what we're doing when we're holding space is about our internal practice, how we're holding space for ourselves, how we're making decisions, how we're accepting guidance from wherever we receive guidance. That's working on our own biases, all of those things. So this internal stuff is really important. It's not just about what you're offering. It's very much about what's going on internally. So what is guiding you? Your intuition, your discernment, as I said earlier, the capacity to make wise choices, your humility. We can't do this work without being humble and recognizing we don't have all the answers, and we shouldn't have all the answers. We need to allow for other person's wisdom in that moment. Courage. It takes a lot of courage, and I don't think I have to tell any of you that to step into a place where people are going through complex journeys, to walk alongside them is a courageous choice. And then curiosity. And part of the reason I put curiosity there is because I don't think curiosity and judgment coexist. When we move into judgment mind, and it's a human thing to become judgmental, to judge a situation, to judge a person's choices. When we can bring curiosity into that situation, the judgment dissipates, because now we are open to another interpretation, open to another way of understanding the situation. And then what supports you? I've kept this one simple because I think it's all kind of covered with two words. We are supported by mystery and community. And by mystery, I use that word to, it's an all-encompassing word to talk about your spiritual support, the ways that you are supported by nature, by spirit, by source, by God, whatever language you use for that external source of support. And then community. And these are very interwoven. Your community is the people that you turn to. It's your family, your friends, your network in a group like this. It's also your animal support, your pets, or your nature can be part of your community. As I said, I've just moved on to Vancouver Island, and I'm finding myself very much supported by the natural world, by the trees and by the lake that I live close to. So that's the external source of support. Now, what's happening inside the bowl? When I started to talk about this concept of holding space, I recognized a need to begin to unravel and explain and give language for what's going on inside. What are you holding space for? And the term I landed on, again, it's not my term, but the term that really started to resonate for me as I began to research and consider this question is liminal space. So liminal, it's a term from anthropology. It's probably a familiar term for you. It's the space between an old reality and a new reality. And actually, I've been expanding this more and more. This is the language I have in my book, but I also recognize that liminality is the space between polarities. It's that gray zone. It's the place of I don't know. It's the place of, recognizing your lack of understanding because it doesn't fit into a binary understanding in the world. And I'm really I deeply believe that liminality is a concept that we need a greater understanding in the world, because there is so much of a clinging to a binary understanding of the world, good and bad, and evil and good, and black and white. That, and even in our genders, we have this liminal, this kind of binary understanding, and that really polarizes us and creates division and conflict. And when we become more comfortable with this liminality, the space in between, we have more capacity for holding space. We have more capacity for relationships that might be complicated. And so I think understanding liminality feels like a critical kind of learning journey that we all need to go on to really deepen our practice of being in liminality. This is the way I defined liminal space in my book. Liminal space is a period in which something, a social hierarchy, a culture, a belief, a tradition, identity, etc., has been dissolved and a new thing is not yet emerged to take its place. It's often a period of uncertainty, ambiguity, restlessness, fear, grief, discomfort, and anguish. And so that's the complexity of that liminality. The way that again, looking for a visual metaphor, one of the ways that I understand liminality is to use the natural world as an example. And in nature, we see the way that the the caterpillar transforms into the butterfly. There is liminality in that space in between, in the chrysalis. That's a time when the caterpillar's identity had to entirely dissolve before it could emerge into the next stage of its life. And they say when you cut open a chrysalis, there's just a gel-like substance in there. It doesn't resemble either the caterpillar or the butterfly. It's just liminal. I think there are some limitations in this, and sometimes when we use a visual metaphor, we get too attached to the metaphor, and I don't want to suggest that because, for example, when it comes to death and dying, is there a butterfly version? I mean, we can interpret it different ways, and is there sometimes people say, but this is a little too linear, and this is a little too with the assumption that something more beautiful is coming after that. And so I don't want to suggest that or overlay too much of that kind of worldview on this understanding, but I do think it is helpful to consider that time of a rearranging of identity and the shape of our lives. So a little bit about the way I understand this liminal space journey. I have used a spiral. I use spirals a lot in my work because I think that very few things are as linear as we maybe want them to be. We tend to spiral through our emotions and spiral through the experience of something. And so that spiral has many, many different emotions along the journey. And we go from chaos to resistance to shock to fear to grief. Some are positive, some are, or I don't even like using that positive, negative. Again, that's a little too binary, but the complexity of the emotions are all there. On the one side, there is the releasing, there's letting go of the identity we used to have to be in that liminality. And then on the other side, there is the becoming, the transforming into whatever the next phase is in that journey. So when we hold space, we are becoming essentially like that chrysalis, creating a container for the messy goo of what liminality is. I want to pause here and I'm going to stop the screen share because I would love to hear your reflections or questions if something came up for you as you were listening. And then how does this concept holding space relate to what you offer as hospice volunteers? And how does liminal space relate to your own life or to the lives that you are supporting? So let me turn off the share for a bit. And you can, I don't know how you normally do these, but if you raise your hand electronically is probably the best way so that it can be easily seen. And I know I have some support people that are also going to help me watch I'm not a great multitasker, I will say, so I'm not great at reading chats and watching what's going on the screen at the same time. So we'll pay attention to what's in the chat as well.
Well, that is fantastic. I mean, the way you articulate that in terms of the space is amazing. I have a tendency to be a problem solver.
Mhm.
And so this really helps me, and I don't want to be. So this is really helpful for me to let go of that and to just be with someone. I also was with my mother when she died, and my siblings were with us, and so that made me cry. That was one, and smile at the same time. And so I just want to thank you for being here.
Mm. Thank you. And we're going to get to what you say about yourself in terms of the problem solving. We're going to get to a bit of a conversation on that a little bit later about the opposite of holding space. Thank you for bringing that in. I see Gail has a hand.
I think I'm here.
Yeah, I can hear you.
As a chaplain for hospice, I find it quite an honor to be able to sit with somebody and by their bedside and just listen. People are fascinating, and most people want to tell their story, and to have somebody just sit there and listen. And it is quite an honor, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yes, I think that must be one of the greatest it's a gift on both sides of the equation, that the person being listened to and the listener are both receiving a gift in that. And I same with you. I feel so honored when somebody actually opens up and allows their story to be shared, and it changes us. And I have an opportunity to often be interviewed on podcasts, and I always walking away from a podcast where somebody has sat there and listened and allowed me to articulate something in a way I might not have spoken it before is one of the best ways to understand yourself. So that listening practice allows a person to witness themselves too. It's not just you witnessing them, it's them hearing words out of their mouth that they maybe haven't spoken before, and articulating themselves and explaining themselves in a way that they haven't had a chance to figure out in their own mind. So I think we kind of underestimate the power of the power of that listening practice.
Even the people with dementia, if you can get them talking, they just change completely, and they smile and they remember their past, and it's really neat.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Emily, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I'm not a volunteer. I'm here because I just felt called when I saw the flyer at the library. And, my parents are getting a little older, and I want to be ready for one day to be there for them or others. And in the last 2 years, I've had 3 friends lose a child. And I think the main reason I'm here is I felt so I just felt like I had a lack of preparation for holding space for them. And what's hard for me is those moments of discomfort where I feel like I want to fix it, instead of just being the bull. Those moments of silence, and not knowing what to say and whatnot. So I guess it's a different subject, but also probably really what we're talking about also.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, one of the things I'll say in response to what you've shared is I think regardless of how much we understand this practice, and I've been immersed in it for years and have been teaching it for years, we still show up feeling unprepared and not always equal to the situation. So I want to offer you some grace in that, because it is a practice that keeps inviting us to go deeper and deeper, and to not show up thinking we know how to do it. Because if we think we know how to do it, that's when we get too proud and we can't show up with humility and grace. And so be in that not knowing, stay in that place of not knowing. You can understand, you can, read my book, or you can go deeper into learning it, and always recognize I don't entirely know what this moment needs, because in that humility, we allow ourselves to be shaped by the moment and allow ourselves to be more present for what that person needs. And it is something that nobody teaches us in high school or university. I've had people come to me and say, medical doctors, for example, say, I wish somebody had told me about this when I was studying to be a doctor, because I'm at so many people's bedside when they're going through the most complicated thing in their life, and I don't have a clue how to respond. And so I don't think many of us ever are equipped for this until we need it, and then we start looking for it. But so, I keep hoping that more and more opportunities will open up for that kind of learning, because I think it is a practice that we all need for our lives, to be in those kinds of relationships. I see Angela, I see a waving of your hand.
Hi, everyone. I've been a volunteer at Hospice in Ithaca, New York for a number of years. And when I first started, I had a really hard time holding space. I found it very difficult to sit in silence. I found it very difficult not to problem solve and offer suggestions to make people feel better. And I learned through quite a while of being better about that. And it's okay to sit in silence. And it's okay just to validate, the patient that you're seeing, what they're saying and feeling. I remember one time we were going through a photograph book, a patient and I, in the early years, and I interjected some of my thoughts about, the place that we were looking at, and realized later on that that wasn't a good way of holding space. And just validating what they were showing me without bringing myself into it is what it's about. So I'm much better at it. It's a lot easier, but occasionally you do want to say something that you think will make someone feel better, which actually won't. They just want to be heard and listened to. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Not long after my blog post went viral, I wrote a few follow-up posts after that, and one of them I wrote was called "Sometimes Holding Space Feels Like Doing Nothing," because that is one of the challenges of it. Like, we're in that situation where we're asked to do very little, and it's almost like the less we do, the more supportive we can be. But to unlearn our need to do something, to be of service, to offer something, that's one of the most complicated kind of unlearnings that there is. And I still find myself in situations. Just this morning, a friend was texting me about a really complicated situation she's going through. And I was like, oh, what can I offer her? Like, that was the first inclination that came to my mind. It's like, what advice can I give her? And I thought, no, that's not what she's asking me for here. So it is that almost daily practice of unlearning our need to be of value in a situation. I see a hand from Bruce/Colleen.
That's Bruce. I have a question or a comment. In today's world, we're always expected to have an answer to a question. And you talk about the transition from being a caterpillar to the butterfly, that in the middle, there's really nothing there, which means there's no answer to the question. What is it going to be? And I think it's learning to live in that space of where it's okay to not have an answer.
Yeah.
But to be prepared. I've had lots of training in knowing where to go get the answer. Lots of training that it's okay not to have an answer, but let me go find the answer to the question and then have them write the question down or whatever. And I've also learned that sometimes I may have the answer, but it's just better to keep my mouth shut and not divulge that answer, because I think it's dependent upon the person asking or demanding, the tone, the body language. I think there's a lot of dynamics involved, and I'm just relating on a lot of experience in other worlds where sometimes it's just better to keep my mouth shut.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I get.
Yeah.
I may be wrong, but I think I kind of hear that in there someplace.
Yeah.
Okay, I got to talk to a man to get her RV repaired. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, I think some of that comes from our education system. We all grew up in schools where you got points for having the answer, and if on an exam you wrote "I don't know," you would lose points. So we were taught to know, or to figure it out, or to find the answer there, and we were not taught to be in that lack of knowing. And I think there are some innovative school systems that are better at allowing kids to just not know and to be in more exploration and rather than the finding of the answers. And I have a friend who says that answers are about the past, questions are about the future. And so she likes to stay in the questions and stay open to the questions, because that leads her into a different possibility in the future. And I love that idea that an unanswered question is actually what allows us to unravel the next stage, to move from that chrysalis into the butterfly. And so to be in a place of not knowing is sometimes the most fertile place to stand. I'm going to return to the presentation and start with the next thing. So I want to talk about our needs, the needs that are showing up, especially when we're in a liminal space, and how we as people who hold space can support people in finding ways of meeting those needs. And I quite specifically say supporting them in finding ways to meet those needs. I'm not saying how we meet their needs, because that's not necessarily our job. Our job is to be of service and of support as they figure out how to have those needs met. It might not be to meet those needs. And that's sometimes the complexity, because we think we need to meet their needs when we're in relationship. And they might not even be asking for that. They might not be asking for anything more than for us to sit with them while they figure out where they're going next. All of us have at the core 3 primary needs. We have lots of other needs, but when we get down to the basics of what we need in order to survive and thrive in the world, safety and belonging and identity needs kind of encapsulate a lot of what we need. And they're fairly straightforward. Our safety needs are both our needs for physical safety. We need shelter. We need to be fed. We need to be safe from predators. We need all of these things. And when you start studying things like trauma, you recognize that a lot of what becomes trauma is when our bodies begin to believe we are unsafe in the world. And it might not be real unsafety, but we have developed a belief system that says that we are unsafe in the world. So those needs become really predominant when we're at our most basic level, and especially if we're triggered in a trauma situation. And then nearly as important, but maybe a little bit secondary if they're prioritized, is our belonging needs. We have a need to be in relationship, in community. We have a need to be supported by people, to have love in our lives, and have a sense that we belong to someone. Everyone has that needs. And I will say that these needs are really intertwined, and I think they evolved in us as humans simultaneously, that our belonging supports our safety and our safety supports our belonging. So we turn to our people to give us that sense of safety. And it is harder to feel safe if we are all isolated from our belonging. And then the third one, it's a little less easy to define, and it is also slightly less prioritized, is our identity needs. We have a need to be who we are as authentic, real people, and to be seen in our identity, and to be valued and recognized for who we are. Now, when we have all of our needs largely met, so you can see this is a Venn diagram, and when they come closer together and we are in that place of having most of our needs met, that's a well-resourced life. Our safety and belonging and identity needs, nothing is really under threat. And so in a situation where you're feeling resourced, and this can change from day to day, from month to month, even minute to minute. You know how sometimes something will happen and suddenly you're feeling anxious and you recognize maybe your safety has been threatened, you're not having that need met. That can change in an instant. But when you are primarily well-resourced, you can live authentically because you're not afraid of your safety is not being threatened. Your identity is being respected by people who care about you, and you have love and belonging. And you can balance your own needs with other people's needs. You tend to be more self-led, resilient, and courageous, and you can make good decisions. Now, each of those needs might be under threat, and what happens when one of those needs is under threat, we're going to prioritize that need. That's why you see that shape is now getting bigger. When your safety is under threat, that might be the only thing you can focus on. In times of conflict, for example, when there's war in your region, in Gaza Strip right now, for example, the only thing they can focus on is their safety needs. How do I protect myself and my family? And how can I make sure that that I feel safe in my body. When that might be revealed when you deprioritize your belonging and your identity in favor of your safety. You might become afraid of relationships because they might threaten your sense of safety. You might kind of isolate from your community because they feel like a threat to you. And you abandon your sense of self. You're going to do everything to keep yourself safe. When your belonging is under threat, then you're going to deprioritize the other ones similarly, and that might be revealed as you're particularly anxious or clingy, or you have a sense of bravado, you're trying to prove yourself. Maybe this might be like a young child or a teenager who's joined a gang because that gives him a sense of belonging. He might do particularly risky things to prove his worth in order to belong to that gang. And like I say, you might make dangerous choices in order to belong. When your identity is under threat, and this might be the case of somebody who is coming to terms with their gender sexuality and realizing that they don't fit in the body that people assume is their identity, that might be revealed as you become self-absorbed, maybe somewhat narcissistic because you're trying to prove yourself and trying to survive. You might make some self-centered and risky decisions, and your relationships are only going to work if they revolve around your identity. So you become more and more kind of dug in to that kind of identity politics that we often hear about. Those are often people that feel threatened in their identity and feel the need to prove themselves. Sometimes what happens is that they're all under threat at once. And I think when people are going through a significant life change or transition, or they've been betrayed by somebody or whatever, they can feel threatened all at once. And I think one of the examples I use for this is the early days of the pandemic. It felt like all three of those were threatened. We were feeling unsafe because we didn't know the threat of this virus. We were feeling like losing some of that sense of belonging because we couldn't be with people we cared about. We had to be alone and isolated in our homes. And many of us had our identity under threat because maybe the things that gave us purpose and meaning, our volunteer job positions or jobs or whatever we did to give us a sense of purpose, was under threat because we couldn't go. We couldn't leave our homes. We couldn't do that. So that's revealed as high anxiety, a disorganized and distractible, flooded nervous system, and inability to make good decisions. And many of you can relate. I remember in the early days of the pandemic, it was like I couldn't get my brain to focus. It just felt like there was so much stress and complexity in the world that that everything was blown out of proportion during that time. When they are all under threat, our nervous systems become activated and often stay activated, where we can't soothe ourselves very well and come back to a equilibrium. What's our emotional response to threat? So I've kind of identified some of the emotions that might show up in one particular threat or another. If your safety is under threat, fear, guardedness, reactivity, aggression, frustration, anger. If your belonging is under threat, isolation, loneliness, resentment, self-pity, sadness, envy. So the emotions tend to be like road signs telling you what's ahead, what you're dealing with, and to pay attention to those emotions help you go deeper in understanding what those needs are. If your identity is under threat, belligerence, pettiness, defiance, arrogance, revenge, and anger. Now, like I said earlier, we will tend to prioritize the most critical needs, the safety and belonging, over the identity. So what often happens if someone has had a long-term threat, they might actually separate from their identity. They become disconnected from who they are. And I do a lot of work, personal development and coaching work with people who kind of in midlife recognize they're not living authentic lives because they have prioritized their safety and belonging and adopted belief systems that their family of origin has passed down to them because that feels safer and gives them more belonging. And they don't actually know who they are or what choices they want to make for their own authentic selves. What happens sometimes is that a false identity will emerge. We'll become somebody that we are not authentically because we're trying to prove our right to belong and trying to gain safety in the world. Times of transition, and I think especially when we're talking especially about death and dying here, those are times of multiple threats. There's a lot going on. We're feeling unsafe, we're losing our belonging, and our identity is significantly under threat. And what can happen during a time of significant transition is that we might actually evolve a new identity or a deepening into our identity. And that's why the color changes here, that we now have to integrate something new about ourselves. And one of the places I taught this not that long ago was with a group of people that were divorcees or people who had been through abusive relationships and were emerging out the other side as single people again, and we're trying to learn who they were now on the other side of that relationship. And so there has to be that integration of that new identity after after there's been that disillusion and disconnection. What we are all seeking is to return to this place, that resourced place where our nervous systems are soothed, where we have capacity for good decisions, where we have relationships, belonging, safety, and can be our authentic selves. This is where we come back to holding space. What we are doing when we are supporting people is that we are holding the container so that they can have those needs met. We are offering them a place of safety and belonging so that they can reintegrate with who they are, with themselves, connect with their own identity, and feel resourced enough to step back into the world in whatever way they need, or transition in the case of death or dying. I'm going to pause again, and I want to invite more questions or reflections, particularly around this safety, belonging, identity, how you see it showing up in people you're supporting or in yourself. And what do you think best supports people in this time of upheaval? Again, I welcome your hands or your chat in the chat room. Deb, I see your hand.
In my experience, for me, it's kind of a matter of not only compassionate listening to their words or their thoughts, but just everything about them. I mean, when my mom was dying, she's a smoker, and she would take her oxygen off to smoke a cigarette. And my sister would go crazy, just go crazy. And I mean, I watched my mom, and there was something about her just being herself and doing exactly what she wanted to do that just made me smile. And for me, that's the most important thing. And I'm also a birth doula. And so being with someone who's giving birth is exactly the same thing. I mean, you just, from moment to moment, you just have to listen compassionately.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I hear in what you're saying is that when we are holding space, often what we need to do, and that's why I say so much of this is internal work, is that we have to release our own needs to be of service to that person's needs in that moment. And I'm not saying that that's an ongoing always thing, that we sacrifice ourselves at the altar of other people's needs, because then we have to also go away and find ways to have our own needs met. But when we are of service, especially somebody going through something like dying, how do we deprioritize our needs? And what I hear in your sister, I mean, she had a need to whatever, control the situation, to have your mom make different choices. Those needs were coming up in her, and that's hard to resist that need. And I remember myself in the year that my mom was dying, this strong need to be witnessed by my mom, kept showing up because I felt I hadn't been able to be authentic with my mom in much of my adult life. And I kept thinking, should I sit her down and have a really honest conversation about the things I want her to witness in me? And I kept wrestling with that question because part of me, the little child in me was not feeling witnessed by my mom. And here she was dying. And I thought, how do I come to some peace with that? Eventually, I recognized in me trying to have that need met, I was not able to see her. And so instead of needing to be seen by her, I had to change my own perspective so that I could see her as she was. And the her as she was not really, did not really have the capacity to see me as I was. And I had to come to peace with that. My mom, for example, had very strong religious beliefs. And so she saw some of what I was doing as sinful and not meeting up to a certain standard for her. And I had to simply accept that that's who she was as she was dying. And so that, again, that's our internal work to let go. And that's a big practice and a big process. And we don't always do it right. Thank you for sharing that, Deb. Linda, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed that, and I liked all the examples that you were given. I see as a volunteer, one of my roles is also modeling for the caregivers, so we can help them to hold space for their loved one as well. But maybe you could speak to the challenges in patients with dementia, because when you think about identity, you know, what I see, if I've never known this person, is the person that now has dementia, and what the caregiver might see is the person they married or their mom or someone like that. So I don't know if you're going to get to that as far as, you know, some of the, you know, you think about the, you know, safety seems real physical and you're, you know, belonging different, but the identity and dementia, I think are a little challenging. So how would we, what are your thoughts on that? What would you advise us to do if we're role modeling, but you know, we have a different experience from, say, the caregiver?
Yeah, thank you. I won't have a lot of time to get to that yet in the presentation, but I will speak to it a bit, and I appreciate that, what you're offering. One of the things that I will say, I often tell people that there are times when you're not the right person to hold space for another person, and that might be a time when you bring somebody else in. When you are too attached to somebody's identity to allow them to release that identity or to transition that identity, that might be time when you need that other support. And like you're saying, that's when a hospice care worker can come alongside you and offer that support, because again, it's about my needs. I need that person to be in their old identity in order for me to have a sense of my safety and belonging. And so what a volunteer or somebody coming alongside can offer is kind of gently opening the door for them to see this new identity. And by, like you're saying, you're able to witness this new identity. What can you offer from your witnessing, from your experience of this person that will, in a gentle way, invite them to release the attachment to that identity? And this is subtle work I'm talking about. This is, you know, sharing stories about what you see, sharing just a little bit of an invitation to see something fresh and to let go of that identity. I don't think that this is something you can teach them in a course when they're in that kind of intense situation, but inviting that openness to something new to evolve. And then also like asking questions around, how is this impacting your sense, you know, maybe not those exact words, but inviting them to express how it maybe is making them feel unsafe to see this new identity. What's coming up for you? What's the lack of belonging? How are you not feeling loved now that your primary person is going through this transition? that invitation, I think when we are witnessed, we can loosen our attachment to those needs too. And we were talking about listening earlier. When I feel genuinely listened to, then I can actually find the resources in myself to meet some of those needs. Like, oh, you know what? I can actually feel safe in this situation, even though there's something triggering my lack of safety. So I would say two things. A, reflecting what you see in the new evolving identity, and B, inviting them in gentle ways to communicate the way that their needs are not being met in that situation. Emily, I see your hand next.
Yes, I'm wondering, I think you kind of answered my question, but if it feels like someone is like really tight and they have they're like holding on really hard to something like an identity, or not wanting to open up or let go, is there ever a time where, as an attendant and someone holding space, where you can sort of help unplug something? Is that, I don't know, that just
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's many ways that you can do that. I don't know that there is a way that you can, but I do think that by modeling it yourself, by softening, and so my recent book is called Where Tenderness Lives, and we won't have a lot of time to touch on what's in there, but what has become more and more true for me is that my own ability to be really tender with myself allows a space to open up to more tenderness. So in a moment when you see constriction, when you see a person resisting and tightening, if I can soften into that moment, there is this whole idea of co-regulation, but I think I would expand it to I don't know even what the right word is, but co-softening almost. Like if you meet that tight ball with a softness, they can see that it's possible. They can lean into that softness. They can invite you to guide them maybe into softening. That's one of the ways that I would suggest. But then also, and people were talking about sometimes people just crack open when they feel heard. Like when you can open up and start asking questions. And part of the reason for me sharing this safety, belonging, identity is for you to consider what questions might someone receive as a way to open up into understanding their own lack of safety in that moment. So a person that's really tight and constricted is in a fear position. They're protecting themselves. They're creating a guarded system for themselves to feel protected. So how do I help them soften that? Well, maybe it's just a question that it invites them to explore what feels dangerous about this moment. What are they at risk of losing? Why are they feeling, disconnected, or they're losing their belongings? So those kinds of invitations or questions can support someone in seeing themselves more clearly, and that's going to offer some softening in that moment as well. Does that make sense for your question? I'm going to move to the next part because I don't want to miss the rest of the presentation. I talked about, we've given some teasers about what this part might be about. But we're going to go into understanding the opposite of holding space, because for me, when I started to unpack this concept and was doing more and more writing, I recognized that sometimes for me to understand a practice, it really helps for me to understand its opposite so that it gives a new light to the practice itself. So we're going to talk about that. Oops. Yeah, so I got mixed up in my presentation. So what happens if our primary needs are consistently unmet? And that's what leads us, in order to hold space and to be the container for other people, we need to be well resourced ourselves. And so that overlapping circles of the Venn diagram, that's a well resourced person. That's a person that has capacity to hold space for somebody else. But if those needs are not met and they're consistently unmet, and we're guarding ourselves, as I say, staying constricted and safe in the world that feels dangerous, then we're going to do the opposite of holding space. And what is the opposite of holding space? When you have a bowl, what do you try to do when you want to control what's in the bowl? You're going to put a lid on that bowl. That's a need to control the situation, a need to direct and control. And that's a concept that I call hijacking space. When we hold space, the bowl is opened. The person has the autonomy and the freedom to do what they need. When I now try to control the space, and how do we try to control spaces? Well, we give a lot of advice that maybe is unsolicited. We try to push people into making choices that we would make. We might gaslight them, we shame them, we might like layer on a lot of our stories. All of these ways are ways of controlling that situation, because as we said earlier too, we feel this need to have the answers. When there's an unknown question, what's the answer? That feels like it becomes my burden, and that's why I tend to hijack space. So while holding space involves supporting without judgment, fixing or controlling the outcome. Hijacking space involves manipulating, disempowering, and imposing various forms of judgment and control. It's from my book. So again, like the holding space has 3 layers, hijacking space also has 3 layers. In the inner layer, what you're offering, or really the opposite of offering, what you're imposing on, is shame, control, judgment, intimidation, dependence, disempowerment, isolation, constriction, and manipulation. The middle layer, what's guiding you, now you're being guided by your fear, your trauma, your wounds, your own prejudice and bias, your social conditioning, your judgment and insecurity. That's coming from that place of constriction that we talked about earlier. In the outer layer, what is supporting you, it's not so much what's supporting you, it's what you don't have, what there's an absence of. This is when there's mystery and community are not there, that absence of spirituality and community that causes you to hijack the space, because now those primary needs are not being met. So why do we hijack space? It's from our own unmet needs, our fears, our social conditioning, because nobody modeled better behavior in our childhood. All of us are unlearning something that was modeled for us, whether we had really controlling parents or we had insecure parents or they were going through their own trauma, whatever it was. Nobody's perfect. I'm a parent myself, so I say this knowing that I've also passed those things down to my children as well as received them from my parents. We have trauma that gets triggered by their behavior. We feel unsafe when there's conflict or uncertainty, so we want to control. We believe we only have value when we're making an obvious contribution. We're tired or stressful or just distracted. Our needs aren't being met in the relationship or situation. We're struggling with mental illness, etc., and don't have a lot of emotional energy available. And just to go back to what Deb offered about her sister needing to control the situation with her mom smoking in that situation, that's a good example of she had her own stuff going on in that time. And there's no judgment there, just recognizing that we are all coming to every situation, every relationship with our own baggage and barriers in that situation. So I'm going to stop the share again and invite your comments, questions. We've already had a few people pop in talking about the temptation to hijack space. So I invite that now. What are your responses to this concept?
I'll share something that is really close to my heart. When my mother died, I flew into France, and I only had a few hours with her. She was in an ICU. But, you know, we removed all the ICU materials and they lowered the lights and made it look like it was going to be okay. And it was okay for her, I think. But I felt really like the whole space got hijacked by one of my sisters who wanted to stay for the duration. I wanted to stay for the duration. I hadn't seen my mom in a year, and she wanted to stay for the duration also. And because she's my older sister, I sort of fell into the role of the little sister who doesn't know any better. And I did not do all the things that I really wanted to do, that I knew that I thought would perhaps help my mother transition. My mother was actually fine transitioning on her own. She had done a lot of practice work, and she was really good. But I felt like I wanted to sing to her. I wanted to climb in bed with her. I wanted to hold her. And I felt held back. And it took me a long time to realize that I gave up my power, but I felt completely hijacked by another person's way of wanting to be. And, you know, it's interesting to carry this with me because I work in hospice, and it's like I knew how I wanted it to be, and I sensed that my mom waited for me to arrive. She died about 12 hours after I arrived. So it was a very interesting time during which my mom was in this coma, but I knew she could hear us. And she was very peaceful. And I thought, well, she probably thinks that here we are again, the two sisters going like this. But I felt hijacked. It felt weird.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I think what you're saying is just so relevant for these complex spaces that we're in and complex relational spaces that we're in, because every one of us, and I have a slide when I teach this for group practice around the three primary needs. I'll sometimes show various versions of this all in one group at one time. So we're all having different needs triggered at the same time, and we're trying to work together as a group. Now, how do we create a space where I can be I can show up with my own unmet needs, but I can also support somebody else's unmet needs. And as you're saying, your focus is to primarily focus on what your mom needs in that moment. And then somebody else hijacks the space. And then, like you say, how much do you then revert back to old family patterns in order to keep the peace in that situation? Because I have a high need for peace in situations like that too. I totally understand, because I've done the same. I've been a peacekeeper in my family as well, to just pull back on my own needs in order for it to stay a peaceful environment. And so, and like you say, even though you may be trained in this with years of expertise, you show up in a room and you're still, especially in a vulnerable moment with your own mom, your own little child, things are going to show up in the room, your own family systems is all going to show up in the room. And so that's what you, as people that are supporting people who are dying and their families, know that these families are complicated and there isn't a right path through this. And one of the things I often say when I teach people about holding space is the best thing to do is to admit how little you actually know about the practice. Like, show up with humility in this practice, because you're not going to ever be an expert. And I tend to cringe a little bit when people refer to me as the expert, the global expert on holding space, because it's like, no, I am in service to this practice to continue learning it, because the minute I think I'm an expert is the minute I'm going to fail. And something's going to get in my way, because I have trauma, because I have social conditioning, I have needs. All these things get in our way all the time. Anyone else? We have a few minutes left. I'd love to offer, if anybody has questions about my new work, as I said, I've written a book called Where Tenderness Lives. This is a very personal book. It's much more memoir based than my earlier book. And it's about my own journey to learn to hold space for myself, and unraveling some of that social conditioning. I talk about my mom and the impact she had on my life, for example, and her dying, and how learning to be at peace with some of the things that were left in my family system. That's part of the book. So I'd love to, if you have questions about that as well. Anne Marie, I see your hand.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I'm leaving my camera off because I don't know if you can tell, I'm a little stuffy. I've been sick for a few
All right,
days.
no problem.
But just two quick things. One, well, with Astrid's comment about her mom, and especially like that she wanted to, her instinct was to climb in bed and sing to her and that. And that really touched me because I did have a chance to do that for my own mother. And I wish I would have climbed in bed with her even more than I did, but I did it a few times. So just a heads up if you have somebody who's actively dying and you have that instinct, just don't think about people in the setting you're in, if they're in a hospital or whatever. Just go with what feels right with you. The other thing I wanted to say is I look forward to looking up your books. And I also wanted to throw another one out there that is part of the curriculum. I'm in the MHTP program, the Music for Healing and Transition program. And for our module on dying, they had us read Companioning the Dying by Greg Yoder. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a quick read, and it is very every chapter is impactful. And I forget the name of the young woman who said, you know, like how can we sometimes, you know, in their needs for reconciliation, is there a way to offer something to help them? And what I really appreciate in his book is he has he has actually chapters on reconciliation needs. So for instance, the reconciliation need for like changing relationships, for changing identity, you know, a number of those. And he has at the end of each chapter just suggestions of how to open the conversation to offer, like, you know, an opening, an entry into, and they're very well done. They're very well put together. It gives you a feeling that, you know, he definitely has the experience and he's just sharing it with us. So I just wanted to mention that if anybody wants to look it up, it's Companioning the Dying by Greg Yoder. And thank you. Like, this is really a great presentation. I love the bowl analogy, the putting the lid on it to, you know, like when you're trying to control. So I love images too. So it's very powerful. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And if anyone else has resources, I see Astrid already put that one in the chat. I was going to say, if you want to offer other resources, feel free to add them into the chat for others as well.
And I keep talking now that my voice is back for a few minutes. A lot of what you talk about also reminds me of the Frank Ostazeski's 5 precepts, you know, and the not knowing, cultivate not knowing is really one that I think is, that's the one I grapple with the most.
Yeah.
And there is such benefits in not knowing, in being curious. You called it curiosity, and I love that term, you know, the curiosity of walking into a room and not knowing what it's going to be like, who are we going to meet, instead of having those preconceived ideas of being somebody who has a certain type of illness and therefore must be in that certain state. It's something that I think we can really all learn to really develop constantly for any situation we go in. It doesn't have to be, you know, going to a bedside.
Yeah.
There is great knowledge in not knowing.
Yeah. Yeah. And also not knowing, and then I will add to that, sitting with the discomfort of that not knowing. And that's a big one. I think that we rush to find comfort, to return to comfort when something leaves us feeling uncomfortable. And I had, fairly recently, a dear friend of mine died, and I was his spiritual companion in the year of his dying. He had ALS and was deteriorating over that year fairly rapidly. So we had weekly calls. He didn't live in the same place, so we would do Zoom each week as long as he could communicate, and then his voice deteriorated. And he was a deeply spiritual person with a deep mindfulness practice, and he left me with a lot of wisdom during that time as he was dying. And one of the things, his body was really deteriorating, and towards the end, the last time I visited him, I flew out to visit him twice in that year, and the last time I visited him, he could move only one hand about 5 inches from his body, and that was other than his neck, that was the extent of his movement capacity. And he said to me, he'd been lying in bed waiting for someone to come to move him. He had to be lifted with a lift, and he was lying in bed, and there was a fly in the room that kept landing on his face. And he could do nothing about it because he had no movement, no control. And he lay there and asked himself, he said, the thought came to me, he says, can I just be with the fly? And he said, that was my spiritual practice for that day. Can I just be with the fly? And that has stayed with me. It's now 2 years since he shared that. And that has become one of my practices. When I get into that place of discomfort and I want to change things, fix things, control things, hijack the space, can I just be with the fly? And simply asking myself that question, it invites a little more peacefulness in my body when I think about Randy lying there in that bed, unable to control the situation. Deb had a hand, and then Bruce, it was the next one.
I was just going to say, what an amazing presentation. And it's really good for us with people that are dying, but it has a major impact on me in my whole life, this presentation. I mean, everything we talked about, like beginner's mind, curiosity, not hijacking even a stranger on the street. I did a workshop for compassionate listening, and this group of people does compassionate listening between Israelis and Palestinians. And it's like, it's the same kind of thing, where is the fear? Who is here? And witnessing, and just witnessing and listening so that you can respond in a way that is not trying to change the whole situation, but just be there. So
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Bruce, I see your hand.
Bruce again. In listening, you're talking about security, you're talking about safety. I heard Maslow's hierarchy of needs there, came through loud and clear to me. And then the next thought came is, while I'm holding space for someone else, I'm also holding space for myself, because those same considerations for the person that I'm holding space for also apply to me, especially in an ever-changing life. I just turned 80. Now, who am I at 80? I'm not the same person I was at 60. What are my limitations now? Because they're greater. My security needs may become a little greater because I'm not able to defend myself. So I've got all this stuff going on. At the same time, the person I'm helping is basically going through a lot of the same similar thoughts, I think. They may be as different as they are, they're similar. They're going to merge, I think, mesh. So I, as the volunteer, have a double role there because I have to check myself as well as pay attention to their needs and make sure I'm keeping a balance within myself as well as helping them. I work with a lot of other people elsewhere, so I have an idea what I'm hearing, and so it's kind of, I have to get out of myself totally somehow in order to be totally available and cognizant of the client's need is kind of what I think. I don't know how far off base I am, but again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs came in, and then there was something else that I'd studied years ago dealing with needs and wants started to come in. So I'm trying to mesh it all together,
Yeah,
but it is a good presentation. I like it.
thank you.
So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I would definitely say that this my work has been informed by a lot of different work and a lot of different teachings, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs is one of them, and also been influenced by nonviolent communication. Really talks about how do we learn to articulate our needs in situations so that we impose less violence on each other. And I just want to offer 2 more screens before we draw to a close with this.
Yes, so we're gonna go over a little bit, and that's okay by me. I
Okay.
understand if people have to leave, I understand, but it's okay by me that we go over a little bit.
All right. I'll just offer these real quickly, and then
Yeah.
we can, I can stick around a few minutes if people still have questions or thoughts. So I just wanted to say in closing, holding space is a practice that acknowledges our humanity, allows us our own emotional experiences, doesn't shame us for being human. And I heard some of that in what Bruce was saying, that we're all human, supports us in our healing and growth. It allows us to be in relationships where there's mutual respect, support, accountability, and love. And one last slide. I do a lot of writing, a lot of teaching around this. You can find a lot more at centerforholdingspace.com, including information about both of my 2 books is on there. And then we run an 8-month program every year called the How to Hold Space Foundation Program. It opens in October 2024. You'll find it on the on the Center for Holding Space website, but there's a quick link to it, just learntoholdspace.com. And I would love to have you consider signing up if people want to go deeper with this practice. It's a modular program, so you can sign up for a couple of modules or do the whole 8 months with us. And there's lots of other resources on that website as well. So I invite you to check that out. And then I didn't mention it on this page, but my business partner and I have just started a Substack where we're doing a podcast and also sharing our writing on, it's called atenderspace.substack.com. So if you want to be on that mailing list for that, go to atenderspace.substack.com. And also our podcast is on Spotify and Apple. Just look for A Tender Space and you'll find us there. So it's been a real pleasure being here with you. And I thank you for your great questions, and thank you for doing this beautiful work in the world. And